Hello, my name is Beck and this is a Books Down Memory Lane video. I saw Whitney from Witty Novels do this and I wanted to do it too and talk about books that obviously were quite popular but also books that were fairly unknown that formed my reading experience from when I was a lot younger to basically to now. So I thought it would be interesting because I'm going to start with a couple of books that one of them people will definitely have heard of but I don't know about the other two. So before I ended up getting into Harry Potter, because I remember getting into that and reading it myself when I was about the same age as Harry, so around 11 or 12, but before I got into that my parents used to read to me a lot as a kid and they read Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia to me. So when the movie came out and it was The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, I was really confused because I knew that that was the second book and Aslan was the main character of the first book, so I was like, why are we starting a movie franchise on book 2? It didn't make any sense to me, but small Beck was very confused, let's just say. But the two books that were read to me before the Chronicles of Narnia was even read to me were, one was called The Magic Faraway Tree, and I don't know if that was also a TV show because I have memories of it when I was really little of it being like almost cinematic, but when you read a really good book that's what the book is like in your head. So I don't know if I had like a really overactive imagination to it from when I was a kid or whether it was actually also a TV show. I think it might have been a TV show but I really don't know. And then the other one was The Magic Wishing Chair, and that was these two kids, I think they were brother and sister, and they got on this chair and it flew them to like magical places, and there was a different magical place in each book. So when I was little I really got into like the portal fantasy when characters go from their world to a magical place. So I think that's why I really like reading books now that have those tropes in it, because I loved those series so much. So I really liked the Every Heart a Doorway series, and that has that angle in it, the magical world angle. And then of course after those things, the very early formative books, I got Harry Potter. Mum read this to me when I was really little, but I remember her saying that she wasn't reading it fast enough because I just wanted to know what happened next, and that's why I picked it up myself. So Harry Potter is definitely a very nostalgic one for me, a very nostalgic one for a lot of people, and I'm yet to do a proper reread in my 20s of these books. So I'm thinking that I might just save that for like the illustrated editions, but I don't know. But then after Harry Potter, which was when I was like 11, 12, I also got a book series called the Trixie Belden series from my school library, and that series was outside my wheelhouse now because it was about this girl named Trixie and she had a couple of really close friends and they built a cubby house outside in their parents' yard, and this was on like a big estate, so it was very, very far away from the house. So they felt like spies when they were in it, and they had a secret whistle that they would communicate with each other with, and they'd also solve crimes that were going on locally around them, usually with people they knew. It was also just a really long series, and I remember getting like more than 13 books deep in that series, and then my library like stopped at a certain point, or just that's what the library had. But that was definitely a formative one for me as well. So I do like the mystery narratives, but I like the character dynamic more than the mystery, but that seemed to combine them quite well. And I don't know if many people really know of this series. I've tweeted about it before and I only got like one person say I recognize that and I loved it as well. So I think this is more like a lesser known series, and I don't know if it was just Australian or if it was international like in the US or the UK, but I really enjoyed it. Obviously I have not continued it, I have not gone back and read it because I don't want it to shatter the illusion of my younger self reading it. I don't want it to be ruined in any way. And then we get into the years of child spies and vampires. So I got into the Alex Rider series next, and I know there was a movie with Alex Pettyfer. It was not like the book at all, but I still love the film. And that series has come back recently with more installments, and I actually really liked the continuation. So I remember writing fan fiction about Alex Rider and him going on cool adventures. So it was a book that really sparked my imagination and my wanting to participate in the mysteries he was on, which was really cool. And then I wanted more of the mystery kind of spy element because I love spy films and stuff, especially like Spy Kids, which is a huge throwback to my childhood. So I ended up picking up Cherub by Robert Muchamore, and I read a ton of his books, and then he also did another series I think, but it was in like a historical setting, and I remember not loving that as much, so I just stuck to Cherub. And I've actually reread the first two books recently, so I'll link a wrap up in the corner or something because I talked about the second book and I really liked it, so I'm really eager to continue that series and reread it now and rediscover all of the things that obviously I missed when I was like 15, because when you're reading stuff you tend to read surface level unless you're looking to dive deeper. And now that I've gone to uni and stuff and done literary studies in a more analytical way, I think I could go back and really appreciate some of the deeper character details that I probably missed the first time around. And then I could not talk about my early formative years of reading if it wasn't for Twilight. Look at this cover. how ridiculous does she look? Look at her boobs, they're so pointy. This is a book that I absolutely adored. I remember reading it with my school friends at the time and we were absolutely obsessed with it. And yes, if I read it now, I'd probably hate the writing style. I remember Bella being a very self-insert character, so you could just really slip into her point of view really easily, and she was just a very judgmental person. So I don't think I'd like reading it now. I've not picked it up to reread in the past like 5-10 years for that reason. I just want to keep my memories of loving it with my younger self. But this was a big one. I don't know what my favorite book would be. I do remember having New Moon. I think I've got it actually. That was my early formative love of urban fantasy coming to a head, because I delved more into urban fantasy later on. And I do remember reading Twilight and not knowing how to pronounce all of the names. And when I read Carlisle for the first time, I remember calling him Carlisle, which is just ridiculous. There was also The Host by Stephanie Meyer, and I have such a distinct memory of reading that when I was like 16, and it was for Christmas because I got it as a Christmas present. And my parents had no idea what this book was, but they got it for me anyway because I wanted it. And then my dad walked into my room and I was just full blown in tears reading The Host, and he just kind of like slowly shut the door and walked away. Like, oh, my daughter's having a moment about this book. So I think I liked The Host more than I liked Twilight, and I'm really sad it didn't get continued because we've been waiting for that book for like 10 years, but I guess we're getting Midnight Sun instead. I don't really talk about her on my channel, but she's a really, really popular author, Cassandra Clare, and she wrote the City of Bones series and the Shadowhunter world and all of that stuff, but I'm not really on the bandwagon. I tried rereading her books like a couple of years ago and I couldn't. I don't know why, I just could not get into the writing again. But when I first read these when I was in high school, I loved them, and I only read these when they were initially a trilogy. So I read them not expecting them to continue, and then they got continued. So I remember loving these so much that I would not stop raving about them to my sister. So my sister, who isn't really a reader, she ended up picking these books up as well and loving them. So I haven't got her to read anything much since, but the City of Bones series holds a special place in my heart because it's something that my sister and I especially bonded over. Even though I don't really like it now looking back, I can appreciate what it did for me when I was a lot younger. And then continuing on with my vampire phase, I don't know who didn't read Vampire Academy, but I adored Vampire Academy. It gave me so many feelings. I think I finished that at uni actually, when I was at uni. So I was probably like 18 or 19 when I finished it. So I was like 16 or 17 when I started that series. So around the time I read Twilight, very vampire phase. I also read Marked by PC and Kristen Cast, and I was obsessed with that series as well. I think I borrowed like 10 books and then my library didn't have them anymore, so I remember borrowing them from a friend. But I loved the lore of that world, the fact that the vampires had like a half moon on them and there was different types of magic as well. And oh, I found that awesome, except for the fact that the love interest seemed to change every time the book changed, which was very frustrating. So it ended up being like a drama romance story instead of a vampire centric story, and I think that's why I ended up stopping it, because it just seemed too drama filled and ridiculous. But at the beginning, with the whole lore and the magical school, I ended up loving it, and I think that's probably where my magical school love came from, because Harry Potter started it for sure, but PC and Kristen Cast definitely continued it. And just to circle back to Vampire Academy, I unfortunately don't have the books anymore because I again tried rereading them and I couldn't get into the type of writing. I think I'm just used to more complicated writing because I read a lot of adult fantasy. So when I go back into like the old starter pack of YA, I'm not connecting with it as much, and I just kind of roll my eyes a little bit, and that's not the attitude I want to have, because I loved those books once upon a time, so I don't want to not like those books anymore. So I've just kind of left them alone, and they're going to remain relics in my mind. And also I loved the film. I know Vampire Academy as a movie didn't really connect to the book so much, but it had a few kind of nuggets in there and I just really liked it. I thought it was a spectacle and a lot of fun, and it really poked fun at itself. It was kind of self-aware, and I actually imagined Rose to look like the main character in the movie. So I think it did a pretty good job, except for the fact that it was very parodic. It was like a parody. I don't know how to describe it, but I enjoyed it, and I know a lot of people will probably judge me for that opinion. So then we're moving from vampire fiction kind of into urban fantasy again, and then into the dystopian. So the bridging point was Paranormalcy, and that is by Kirsten White? Kirsten? And I know that she's written more YA recently, like in the past couple of years, but that was probably one of her very early works, and I think it was about angels, and the main character was like part angel or something, and there was fire and the ability to manipulate fire. I barely remember it, but at the time I was captivated, and then I wanted more YA, so I went over into dystopian, and that's when I got obsessed with Divergent and The Hunger Games. Adored them both. And I'm one of those people who don't know why people are so angry about the third book, Allegiant, because I didn't actually mind the fact that it did the things it did. I just don't like the way it did them. Why have a book series with the main character that isn't split perspective until the final book? Like, that's a stylistic thing, but I liked what the plot did. And I love The Hunger Games as well, although my favourite is definitely the first book, and my favourite is definitely the second movie, because I saw all of the films at midnight screenings. And unlike the others, I think that's a series that I could probably reread now, because I mean, I want to, and I don't know if I'll pick up the new Hunger Games book, because I'm not hugely into President Snow. But I'll probably reread The Hunger Games at some point because I want to revisit that world. So while I was still at high school, kind of after this vampire phase and after the young adult phase for like dystopian stuff, I started to get into manga, and I remember watching the show Inuyasha. I don't know if anyone else remembers it. It's about a girl from our time named Kagome, and she lives next to a shrine, her family's shrine, and one day she ends up falling down the well in that shrine and she gets transported back to feudal Japan, and there are demons there, and she accidentally shatters a gem, and this gem means that demons can pick up pieces of it and become a lot more powerful, so she has to team up with a group of characters and go and recover all of these pieces of the gemstone basically. And I really enjoyed that series, but that was an anime that I watched and I never read the manga. The manga that I started with was Bleach by Tite Kubo and also Death Note, and these are vastly different series. This is a Shonen Jump series. It's more like adventure action, and it's about a guy named Ichigo, and one day his family are getting attacked by these demons, and only really he can see them. His sisters kind of can, but they're more blurry, but he ends up fighting them off with the help of a Shinigami who is a god of death, and she is injured and then transfers her powers to Ichigo, and it's kind of like death god powers for rent because she needs to get strong enough again to get them back, and he has to kill all the demons that she is assigned to in the meantime. And there's a whole arc of the story that is about the Soul Society, which is where Rukia, the Shinigami character, is from. So it's a really rich world. I like the fact that there is space for these characters to develop with each other, and there are cool battles, and there was always interesting lore from the world being introduced in each volume, and that's why I got addicted. But it's a very long-winded series, so I remember reading up to like volume 22 or something, 23 in the early 20s, and then stopping because I knew it was going to be very long-winded. So I loved this, and I borrowed most of them from a friend, and I've since watched some of the anime as well and loved it. And then Death Note, it has Shinigami in it, but in a different way. So the Shinigami are very much like gods. They sit above the world in the heavens and they look down upon all the humans, and they have these things called death notes, the title of the series. And when they write someone's name in the death note, that person dies, and they can specify how the person dies, or they can leave it and they will die of a heart attack within 60 seconds. So one day one of the death gods, the Shinigami, is bored, drops his note onto the ground, and a character named Light finds it. And Light is a really intelligent guy. He finds this death note and he starts experimenting with it, and because he starts experimenting with it, obviously people start dying, and he starts to kill criminals, and he thinks he's like a pariah that is duty bound to rid the world of evil. But if he's killing people, isn't he the criminal himself? And so he incurs the wrath of the detective, the mysterious detective named L. And so you don't know L's face and you don't know L's true name, and in order to kill someone you need to know their name and their face. So this is a very cat and mouse story, and it was very intricate, and it really just surprised me all the time. It's not even very long either. I think it's got like 8 to 10 volumes. It's definitely under 15. So it's a series that is easily digestible, and the anime was really good as well. So loved these two. And I also read Naruto as well, which is a manga about ninja. So I had a huge manga phase when I was younger. I'd say that was like 17 to 18-year-old. Honestly, I'm still going through it because I love manga. So you'll notice that I'm a fantasy reader now, but I didn't really read a lot of fantasy like growing up. Obviously I read the Portal fantasy stuff like very early on, but when I was older I didn't really know what to pick up, and I'd look at the fantasy shelf in the bookstore and I'd be very overwhelmed because all of them were really long, and then I just never really reached for them until people recommended stuff to me that were quite close friends. So I remember reading Assassin's Apprentice, the first Robin Hobb book, in late high school when I was like 17 or 18 because my friend recommended it to me and he had the whole series, and he also just wanted wanted someone to talk to about it because he didn't have anyone who'd also read it. So I read that series, I got my dad hooked on that series, I got my best friend hooked on that series. So Robin Hobb holds a place in my heart that's very special because she was like my formative fantasy reader self. I don't know if that makes any sense, it probably doesn't, but she was the reason that I got into loving fantasy. Her and The Name of the Wind, which was also recommended to me by my best friend. So I devoured that book in like 2 days, and I've since recommended that to friends, and those same friends have devoured it in a similar time period to what I devoured it in, and it's flipped the switch in their brain that's gone from non-reader to reader. So I think it was a pretty important book in terms of getting people into fantasy, but if you want to read the rest of the series, the third book isn't out yet, so sorry in advance. So Name of the Wind, which is behind me, it's over here, but I'm not getting it out because there's so much on that shelf. And then that led the way into Bookstagram, and Bookstagram had a ton of recommendations for me. And then from Bookstagram, I found Brandon Sanderson. So Brandon Sanderson, now one of my absolute favorite authors. I've pretty much read almost all of his work that I can think of, but the Mistborn trilogy and The Way of Kings are two excellent stories of his. And then from the Mistborn trilogy, from The Final Empire, Well of Ascension, and Hero of Ages, after those ones, I started Alloy of Law, which is the Mistborn series 300 years in the future, and I fell in love with Alloy of Law. Can you even see it? It's so bright. I missed out on a big series. I just realized I was about to wrap up this video saying, you know, I've gone from portal fantasy to vampire fiction to dystopian to fantasy, and I missed out a vampire book, which is just unlike me. So at the very end of high school, when I was like 18, I was into a series called Anita Blake Vampire Hunter, and this was a very, very urban fantasy book. It was about a girl named Anita. Well, she was more like a woman because she was working at a full-time job, and I don't know what her job was called, but part of it was finding out information. So she'd have to go to people who had been murdered or killed or just passed away, and she was a necromancer, so she'd resurrect them. And these characters that she resurrected were only good for like either a day or a couple of hours within resurrection, so that she could only get specific information at a specific time, and she would use that information obviously to investigate. So I think she was like a PI, like a personal investigator or a detective of some kind, like a consultant, and that really lends into my love of urban fantasy and my love of a consultant that kind of is a bit rogue because they work for their own rules even though they're employed by the police. And I think that's why I'm loving the Dresden Files, because it's a very similar formula. But anyway, Laurel K. Hamilton is the author. They ended up going down the route of just being like a self-insert, kind of like what Twilight was. You could just really get into the character's head really easily, and it ended up being more romance and smut focused instead of detective and magic focused, which is what I started the series for. And so I ended up stopping after like 10 books or something, but I know the series went on for a lot longer than that. And obviously it had like werewolves and were-leopards and all these were-creatures and vampires, and so I just want another series that is like that, but more like the start than the end. We've gone from like Magic Faraway Tree to Trixie Belden, and then Twilight and Divergent and the Hunger Games. ERAGON, which I missed, but I did read that when it first came out, and I finished the entire series, I think 4 books. Was disappointed by the ending and then haven't looked back since. And then after that I got into Robin Hobb and The Name of the Wind, and then my favourite book, The Art of Racing in the Rain by Garth Stein, told from the perspective of a dog, which I thought would be not what I was into considering it's like adult fiction, but I ended up loving it and I'm obsessed with it. And then before I got into Goodreads, I think I reread that book like 7 or 8 times. Now I love Brandon Sanderson. I read urban fantasy still with the Dresden Files and high fantasy and all that stuff, so I liked just delving into the books that I loved in the past to see if anyone had also read them and like spotlight what I had read early on in my reading life, because I think a lot of people probably have read the Alex Rider series. I know that's a pretty popular one, but when I look back to like the Magic Faraway Tree and stuff, and even all of the Narnia stories, I don't know how many people would have read all of those. So I just wanted to make this video and have a bit of a sit down chat. I hope you like this anyway. Let me know what you read when you were a kid, because I'm always interested to see what I was on the bandwagon for and what I've potentially missed, because I've probably forgotten stuff on here as well. Like a Maximum Ride, which just popped into my head, which was again more like urban fantasy paranormal, because it's about kids who escape from a lab and they've been genetically spliced with birds, so they've got really hollow bones and they've got wings, so they're on the run from this lab who's trying to get them back. I can't believe I've missed stuff, but the more I start thinking about it, the more I start remembering things. So anyway, I'll chat to you down in the comments. Let me know what formed your reading life. I would love to hear, because I want to see if we've got stuff in common. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye.